Welcome back to Family Ties and Lies, the channel where blood is thicker than water, but secrets are the thickest of all. Every family has a perfect smile for the cameras, but what happens when the doors finally close? We know that behind every flawless holiday dinner lies a hidden web of deception waiting to unravel. Here, we dig into the most shocking family dramas, bitter betrayals, and dark mysteries that people try to bury forever. Whether it is a brutal feud or a hidden past, we uncover the absolute truth. Grab your snack, get comfortable, and hit that subscribe button right now. The ultimate family secrets are about to be exposed. Today's story comes from a woman who almost let her own family convince her she was losing her mind. She sat alone in a courtroom with no lawyer beside her, while the people she loved most tried to take everything she had. They thought she was finished. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Listen closely. This is her story. In her own words. Maybe they were right. Maybe I really was losing my mind. That is what I believed as I walked into that courtroom until I saw my daughter-in-law smile. And in that single moment, everything became clear. She was not trying to protect me. She had been hunting me for 2 years. I had spent my whole life teaching broken people how to stand. Now I would have to remember how to stand for myself. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I walked into that room believing the worst thing a person can believe, that the people who said I was confused might be telling the truth. I had begun to doubt my own memory. I had begun to flinch at my own thoughts. When you are 67 years old and the two people closest to you keep telling you, gently, kindly, that you are slipping, you start to wonder if the floor under your feet is really there. The courtroom was small, wood paneling gone dark with age, a flag in the corner, a clock on the wall that read 9:40 in the morning. I sat at a long table on the left side of the room, and the chair beside me was empty. There was no lawyer in it. I had no one to lean toward, no one to whisper to, no one to object when they began to take me apart. I sat with my hands folded on a worn leather notebook, and I waited. Across the aisle sat my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, in a soft gray dress, her hands clasped like a woman in prayer. Beside her sat my son, David, my boy. He would not look at me. He kept his eyes on the table, on his own hands, on anything in that room that was not his mother's face. Their lawyer rose. He was a tidy man with a smooth voice, the kind of voice that makes cruelty sound like concern. He told the judge that this was a sad case, a heartbreaking case. He said the woman at that table had once been a capable person, but that time had taken its toll, that she could no longer manage her own affairs, that she had been confused, forgetful, vulnerable to influence. He said the family only wanted to protect her. Then Vanessa spoke. She did not raise her voice. She never had to. She can't always remember what day it is, she said softly, and she let her eyes fill. We love her. That's why we're here. People in the gallery nodded. A few of them looked at me the way you look at something fragile, the way you look at something already broken. I felt the old doubt reach up for my throat. I almost believed them again sitting there. That is the part no one tells you about being old and alone, how easy it becomes to agree with the people who are erasing you. And then I looked at Vanessa, and she smiled at me, just for a moment, just for me. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who has counted the silverware and already knows where it will go. I had seen that exact smile before on her face when she thought I was not looking. That smile saved me. It reminded me that I had not imagined any of it. The judge had been quiet through all of this. His name was Harold Whitman, a tall man with steel gray hair and the still patient eyes of someone who has heard 10,000 people lie to him. He had a folder open in front of him, my folder, and as the lawyer talked, he had been reading, slowly, page by page. He did not interrupt. He let them finish. And then, in the silence that followed, he set down his pen and looked up at me over the top of his glasses. "Mrs. Sullivanport," he said. His voice was careful. "Before we go any further, I have a question." The room went still. "Who exactly are you?" I felt David's head come up. I felt the whole room turn. Vanessa's smile faltered at the edges, just slightly, the way a still pond shivers when something moves beneath it. David finally looked at me. His face had gone pale, and his mouth opened, and the question that came out of him was barely a whisper. "Mom, what's in that file?" I did not answer either of them. Not yet. Some answers have to be earned, and theirs had cost me 40 years. They never bothered to learn. I had spent my whole life being measured by people who held the wrong ruler. My family had decided long ago what I was: a quiet woman, an aging woman, a woman who would sign whatever was put in front of her. They had measured me wrong. And in a few hours, in that small room with the dark wood and the clock on the wall, they were going to find out exactly how wrong. My name is Margaret Sullivan. Everyone who loves me calls me Maggie. And this is the story of the day my family learned they had measured me with the wrong ruler, and how I taught them, one truth at a time, to read it right. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you back to my hands. The first thing you should know about me is that I have always trusted my hands more than my voice. For 40 years, I helped broken people learn to move again. I was a physical therapist, which is a fancy way of saying I spent my days teaching bodies to do what they had forgotten. A man who had a stroke and could no longer lift a spoon. A young mother whose spine had been crushed in a car accident. A boy of 9 who was told he would never walk after the fever took his legs, and who walked across his own kitchen 11 months later, while his parents wept in the doorway. I remember that boy more than almost any patient I ever had. His name was Tommy. He is a grown man now, somewhere in Ohio, with children of his own. He sent me a card every Christmas for 30 years. I kept every single one in a shoebox under my bed. That is the thing about my work. You do not just fix a knee or a shoulder. You sit with people on the worst days of their lives. You hold their hand while they cry from the pain. You learn to hear the small lie a person tells when they say, "I am fine," through gritted teeth. You learn patience. You learn to notice what others miss, and you learn to write everything down. In my profession, you keep records, careful ones, every session, every exercise, every small improvement, and every setback. If a patient took 2 steps on Monday and 4 steps on Wednesday, you wrote it down with the date and the time, because someday a doctor or an insurance company might ask, and you had better be able to prove it. I kept clinical notes for 40 years. It became as natural to me as breathing. I could not sit through a single meaningful conversation without my hand reaching for a pen. I tell you this now because it matters later. It matters more than anyone in that courtroom understood. My husband, Robert, was a high school history teacher, a kind man with a soft laugh and terrible taste in neckties. We were married for 31 years. We never had much money, but we had enough. A small house on Maple Street with a crooked porch he kept promising to fix. A garden in the back where he grew tomatoes that never quite ripened in our short northern summers. We had one son, David. Robert died on a Tuesday in October, 6 years ago, of a heart attack so sudden that there was nothing my 40 years of medical training could do. One moment he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, complaining about the price of gasoline. The next moment he was gone. I did the chest compressions myself on the floor of our kitchen until the paramedics arrived and gently told me to stop. I knew before they said it. My hands had already told me what my heart was not ready to hear. After Robert died, the mornings were the hardest. I would fill the kettle and take down 2 cups from the cupboard, the way I had every morning for 31 years, his and mine. Then I would stand there at the counter with that 2nd cup in my hand and remember and put it back every single morning. You would think a person would learn, but the hand reaches for what the heart still wants. And mine kept setting out a cup for a man who would never drink from it again. David called less and less. At first there were reasons. He was busy with work. The baby kept them up at night. Vanessa needed help with something. There was always a reason, and I told myself I understood, because that is what mothers do. We make excuses for our children long after they have stopped earning them. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing I have left worth giving. I missed having someone in the house who knew me, someone who knew that the quiet woman setting out the wrong number of coffee cups had once put a broken child back together with nothing but patience in her own 2 hands. The radio stayed on in that house from morning until night, not for the music, but for the sound of a human voice that was not my own. Loneliness makes you careless in ways you do not notice until it is too late. It makes you grateful for any attention at all. It makes you overlook the small, wrong notes, the things that do not quite add up, because the alternative is to go back to the silence. So when David and Vanessa began visiting more often that final year, I let myself believe it was love. They would sit in my living room and ask gentle questions. How was I sleeping? Was I eating properly? Did I ever forget to lock the door, or leave the stove on, or miss an appointment? I did not understand then what those questions were really for. I thought my son was finally coming home to me. I thought my daughter-in-law had decided to care. I had spent 40 years learning to tell the difference between a hand that reaches out to lift you up and a hand that reaches out to hold you down. I knew that difference better than I knew my own name. And yet, in my own living room, with my own family, I did not let myself feel it. I was tired, and I was alone. And I wanted so badly to be loved that I closed my eyes to what my hands already knew. So when they sat across from me one gray afternoon, the two of them side by side on Robert's old sofa, and said they had something important to discuss, I smiled. I poured the tea. And I had no idea that the conversation about to happen was the first careful step toward taking everything I had left. The conversation began with the word concerned. Vanessa said it first. She leaned forward on Robert's old sofa, her hands clasped together as though in prayer, and she said, "Maggie, we are concerned about you." David nodded beside her, slow and grave, like a man agreeing to something he had rehearsed in the car. I held my teacup and waited. "We worry about you being all alone out here," Vanessa continued. "This big old house, the stairs. What if you fell and no one knew for days? What if you left the stove on?" She tilted her head, and her voice softened into something that sounded almost tender. "We just want you to be safe." I told her I was perfectly capable of living in my own home. I had lived in it for 35 years. I knew every creak in every floorboard. But that was when David spoke. And what he said stopped me cold. "Mom," he said quietly, "you forgot my birthday last month." I set down my cup very carefully because my hand had begun to shake. I had not forgotten his birthday. I would have sworn it on Robert's grave, on the morning of the day, the way I had done every year of his life. I had called him at 9 o'clock and sung the first line of the birthday song into his voicemail, the way I always did, off-key, the way he used to laugh at. I told him this. I told him exactly what I had sung and what time I had called. David looked at me with such sadness that it frightened me more than anger would have. There was no message. "Mom," he said. He glanced at Vanessa, and she gave him a small, sorrowful nod, the kind you give to confirm a painful truth. I checked my voicemail that whole week. David said gently, "There was nothing from you, nothing at all." I sat there in my own living room, and I felt the ground move beneath me, because I remembered it. I remembered standing at the kitchen window with the phone to my ear, watching a cardinal on the bird feeder, singing to my son. I remembered it the way you remember things that are real. And yet here was my boy, with no reason in the world to lie to me, telling me it had never happened. That was the moment the doubt first got its hand around my throat. If I could be so certain of something that had never occurred, then what else in my mind could I trust? Maybe I had only meant to call. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe Vanessa and David were right, and the woman I had always been was quietly coming undone, and I was the last to know. I did not understand then what had truly happened. I understand it now. There had been a message. I had sung to my son exactly as I remembered, And sometime that week, while I was at the grocery store or asleep or simply in another room, that message had been found and deleted by a woman who needed my son to believe his mother was disappearing. But I did not know that yet. So I sat on my own sofa and let two people I trusted convince me that my memory could no longer be trusted. It is a terrible thing to be talked out of your own mind by the people you love. You do not even fight it. You are too busy being afraid. When they came again in the spring with brochures, I did not have the strength to refuse. The brochures were for a place called Cedar Hollow, a senior living community, the cover called it, with photographs of silver-haired people laughing over card games and walking through manicured gardens. "It will be good for you," Vanessa said. "People your own age, activities, nurses on staff, in case anything happens." In case anything happens, as though I were a clock already running down. David did not look at me when he signed the paperwork. He kept his eyes on the pen. I think some part of him knew, even then, that something was wrong. But Vanessa had spent that whole year whispering in his ear, building him a mother who is vanishing a little more each month. And a frightened son is an easy son to lead. I want to tell you that I went down fighting. I did not. That is the truth. And it took me a long time to make my peace with it. I was grieving my husband. I was doubting my own mind. I was so achingly tired of the silence in that house that part of me almost welcomed the idea of people my own age, of nurses down the hall, of no longer carrying the whole weight of my life alone. So I packed 35 years into cardboard boxes. I gave Robert's tomato garden to the young couple next door. I kept the shoebox of Christmas cards and our wedding photograph and the good china my mother left me. And on a cold morning in April, my son drove me to Cedar Hollow and carried my boxes up to a small room on the second floor that smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. He hugged me in the doorway. "It will be good for you, Mom," he said, echoing his wife. "I will visit all the time." He did not visit all the time. He visited twice in the first 3 months. I stood at the window of that small room and watched his car pull out of the parking lot. And something I had been holding back for a year finally broke loose inside me. Not anger, not yet. Just a deep, quiet grief. My husband was gone. My home was gone. And now even my own son believed I was a woman to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. I did not know that Cedar Hollow, the place they sent me to fade quietly away, was about to give me back the one thing I had lost when Robert died. It was going to give me a friend. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she lived in the room directly across the hall. I met Eleanor Whitfield on my 3rd day at Cedar Hollow, and she did not like me at all. I was sitting alone in the common room, staring at a jigsaw puzzle someone had abandoned half-finished, when a sharp voice behind me said, "You are doing that wrong. The sky pieces go on the left." I turned to find a small, fierce woman in a wheelchair, perhaps 80 years old, with white hair pinned up like a queen and eyes that could cut glass. She had the bearing of someone who had spent her whole life being obeyed and saw no reason to stop now. I told her, as politely as I could, that there was no wrong way to do a puzzle. She studied me for a long moment. "There is always a wrong way," she said. "Most people simply never learn the right one." Then she wheeled herself to the table, picked up a piece, and set it perfectly into place. We worked in silence for an hour. Neither of us said another word. It was the most pleasant hour I had spent in months. That was Eleanor, prickly as a thistle and twice as stubborn. But I had spent 40 years with difficult patients, and I knew that the sharpest people are often the ones protecting the softest hearts. So I did not let her chase me off. I came back the next day, and the day after that, and slowly, the way you coax a frightened muscle back to life, I drew her out. I learned her story in pieces, the way you learn anything worth knowing. Eleanor had been a widow for many years. Her husband had built a business from nothing, something to do with manufacturing, and left her comfortable when he passed. More than comfortable, though she never spoke of money directly. She had no children. There had been a son, once, but she would press her lips into a thin line whenever his name came near, and I learned not to ask. She had nieces and nephews scattered across the country who remembered her existence chiefly around the holidays, and chiefly, I suspected, around the question of her will. She was alone, the way I was alone. Two women set aside by the people who should have loved them. I think that is what bound us together, in the end. We recognize something in each other, the particular loneliness of a person who has given a great deal and been left with very little company to show for it. Eleanor's body was failing her. Her heart was weak. Her legs no longer held her, and there were mornings the pain in her joints kept her in bed. The staff at Cedar Hollow were kind enough, but they were overworked and rushed, and an old woman in pain learns quickly which complaints are worth voicing and which simply go unheard. But I knew bodies. I had spent my whole life knowing them, so I began to help her. Not officially. The staff would not have allowed it. But in the quiet afternoons, I would go to her room, and I would work her stiff hands gently between mine, the way I had done for thousands of patients, easing the joints, coaxing the blood back into them. I showed her small movements she could do in her chair to keep her shoulders from locking up. I sat with her when the pain was bad and talked her through it, the way I used to talk frightened patients through the worst of their recovery. "You know what you are doing," she said to me one afternoon, watching me work her fingers loose. It was not quite a question. I told her I had been a physical therapist for 40 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have never forgotten. "They put a treasure in this building and called it broken," she murmured. What a foolish world. No one had said anything like that to me since Robert died. I had to turn toward the window so she would not see my eyes fill. We became, in those months, something more than friends. I do not have the word for it. She was older than me by more than a decade, but it did not feel like a mother and a daughter, or even two friends. It felt like two soldiers who had ended up in the same trench at the end of a long war, grateful beyond words simply not to be alone in it. I told her about Robert and the tomatoes that never ripened, and the boy named Tommy who walked across his kitchen. She told me about her husband and the business, and a trip to Italy she had taken as a young bride that she described so vividly I could smell the lemon trees. We played cards. We did puzzles, always the sky pieces on the left. We laughed, real laughter, the kind I had thought I might never feel again. And every visit, out of 40 years of habit, I wrote it down. Not clinical charts anymore. Just a small notebook I kept in my cardigan pocket. The date. A line or two about how Eleanor was doing, what we talked about, how her hands moved that day, whether the pain was better or worse. It was instinct, nothing more. I did not know I was building a record. I did not know that those ordinary little notes, scrawled in my careful hand on ordinary afternoons, would one day stand in a courtroom and speak for a dead woman who could no longer speak for herself. I only knew that for the first time since my husband died. Someone in the world was glad when I walked through the door. I did not know how rare that was about to become, because not everyone was glad about my friendship with Eleanor Whitfield. One person, in particular, had begun to watch us very closely, and she was smiling. Vanessa began visiting Cedar Hollow far more often once she learned about Eleanor. It was strange at first how much warmer she became. For months after they left me there, I had seen her perhaps twice. Then, almost overnight, she was a devoted daughter-in-law. She came on Sunday afternoons with flowers and store-bought cookies, and she sat in my little room asking bright, cheerful questions. How was I settling in? Had I made any friends? Was anyone here especially kind to me? I should have wondered why the questions always circled back to the same place. But I was grateful for the company. And gratitude makes a poor watchdog. It was on her third or fourth visit that she met Eleanor. I had wheeled Eleanor down to the common room for our afternoon puzzle, and Vanessa arrived early. I watched my daughter-in-law cross the room. I watched her notice Eleanor, and I saw something flicker across her face that I did not have a name for yet. She approached us with that smile of hers, the one that showed all her teeth and never quite reached her eyes, and introduced herself as Margaret's daughter-in-law. Eleanor looked her up and down the way she looked at a puzzle piece that did not belong. She did not smile back. She did not offer her hand. She simply studied Vanessa for a long, deliberate moment. The way a woman studies the fine print of a contract she has no intention of signing. And then she turned back to the puzzle and slid a piece of blue sky into place. "How nice," Eleanor said at last, not looking up, "that Margaret has family who finally visit." It was a small thing, but I saw Vanessa's hand tighten on the back of my chair. After that day, everything changed, though I was slow to understand how. Vanessa wanted to know everything about Eleanor. She asked her questions in that sweet, concerned voice. Did Eleanor have family of her own? Was she comfortable here? Did she have someone looking after her affairs? She brought her cookies, too, complimented her white hair and her sharp mind, fussed over her like a long-lost granddaughter. To anyone watching, she was simply a kind young woman, taking an interest in a lonely old lady. But Eleanor was not fooled for a single moment. She had spent 80 years learning to read people who wanted something from her, and she read Vanessa the way I read a limp. She waited until we were alone that evening to tell me. "That girl is measuring my furniture," she said. I asked her what she meant. She set down her teacup before she answered, and there was no humor in her at all now. "I have seen her kind before. Maggie. The smile, the hand on your arm, the worried little questions. The whole time, they are counting. She wants to know what I have and who gets it and how she can work her fingers into it." She looked at me then, and her voice gentled, which somehow made it worse. "And she does not like that you and I are friends. She does not like it one bit. You watch." I told her she was being unkind. I told her Vanessa was family, that she was simply being thoughtful. Eleanor did not argue. She only gave me a long, tired look, the look you give someone who refuses to see the snake coiled in their own garden, and then, quietly, almost to herself, she said the thing I have never forgotten. "Good women are the easiest to rob," she said. "You cannot imagine the things other people will do, so you never see it coming." I did not want to believe her. This was my son's wife, the mother of my grandchild. I had spent my whole life choosing to think the best of people, and I was not ready to stop. Not even then. But the small wrong notes were piling up, and even I could not ignore them all. Vanessa began suggesting, gently, that I was spending too much time with Eleanor. "It is not healthy," she said, "to attach yourself to someone so ill. You will only be hurt when something happens." She started arriving during my afternoon visits and finding reasons to pull me away. A phone call I needed to make, a form I needed to sign. Once she simply wheeled Eleanor back to her room, mid-conversation, saying the poor dear looked tired, while Eleanor glared at her with the fury of a trapped hawk. And then there were the comments about my memory. They had never really stopped, but now they sharpened. In front of the Cedar Hollow staff, Vanessa would sigh and say things like, "Maggie gets so confused these days," or, "She tells the most wonderful stories, but you cannot always trust the details." She said it kindly. She said it with that smile. And I watched the nurses begin to look at me a little differently, a little more carefully, as though I were a glass they expected to drop. I understand now what she was doing. She was building it everywhere at once, with David, with the staff, with anyone who might one day be asked the question. A sweet, confused old woman who imagined things, who could not be trusted, who had perhaps latched onto a wealthy dying friend out of some sad delusion. She was laying her foundation, brick by patient brick, long before I ever knew there was a wall going up around me. One afternoon, I came back to my room and found my little notebook had been moved. I always kept it in the left drawer of my nightstand. It was in the right. A small thing, the kind of thing a confused old woman might do herself, and then forget. But I was not confused. My hands remembered exactly where I had left it, and standing alone in my room with that notebook in the wrong drawer, a cold thread of fear went through me. Someone had been reading it. and whoever it was wanted to know exactly what I had been writing down. After the notebook, I started paying attention. 40 years of reading bodies had taught me to trust the small signals, and now, too late perhaps, I was finally listening to them. The signs were everywhere once I knew to look, and the strangest of them came through the telephone. David called one evening, and his voice had that careful, sorrowful tone I had come to dread. "Mom," he said, "I got your message, the one about feeling lonely and forgetful. I just want you to know I am here." I held the phone against my ear, and I felt the floor tilt under me. "I sent you no message. David," I said. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has a whole argument folded inside it. "Mom," he said gently, "you sent it this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I am looking at it right now." I told him I had been in the common room at 4 o'clock, doing a puzzle with Eleanor. I told him my phone had been in my room the entire time. I told him, and I could hear how it sounded even as I said it, like a confused woman insisting the world was wrong rather than her own memory. "You see," he said softly. And that was the worst of it, the gentleness. "This is what Vanessa and I have been worried about." And then he said he loved me and that he only wanted me safe. And he hung up, and I sat in the dark of my little room holding a phone that had apparently betrayed me to my own son. For a long while, I believed it might be true. That was the trap, you understand. When everyone you love keeps showing you proof that you are coming apart, you stop trusting the one witness who could defend you, yourself. It was Eleanor who pulled me back. I told her about the message I did not remember sending, expecting her to look at me the way David did, with that careful pity. She did not. She set down her puzzle piece, and her old eyes went hard and bright. "Who has your phone?" she asked, "when you are not holding it?" I told her I left it in my room when I went to meals, to the common areas, to her room down the hall. "And who comes and goes from that room?" "Maggie." "Who knows where you keep your things? Who has been moving your notebook?" I did not answer. I did not have to. "She is sending those messages," Eleanor said, leaning forward in her chair, "from your phone to her husband, a confused old woman, writing sad little notes about her own failing mind. She is not finding the evidence, child. She is making it. And you are the fool she is building it out of." I wanted to tell her she was wrong. The words would not come, because somewhere deep inside, in the part of me that had spent a lifetime reading the truth in trembling hands, I knew she was right. That was the moment the doubt left me. Not all at once, but the worst of it. The corrosive whisper that had been telling me for a year that I was losing my mind finally went quiet. There is a strange relief in discovering that you are not, in fact, going mad, that the gaps and the confusion were never inside your own head at all. They had been placed there, carefully, by someone who needed you to break. The relief lasted about a minute. Then came the fear, because if she was building evidence, it could only be for one thing. Vanessa intensified everything in the weeks that followed. She told the Cedar Hollow staff that I had begun to wander, that I had been found confused in the hallways at night. None of it was true, but she said it sweetly, with tears in her eyes. And who questions a worried family member? She arranged for a doctor of her own choosing to evaluate me, a tired man who asked a few quick questions while glancing at his watch, a man who had plainly read her account of my decline before he ever shook my hand. And she worked to keep me away from Eleanor. She told the staff the old woman was a bad influence, filling my head with paranoid ideas, that for my own well-being my visits should be limited. There were afternoons I was simply told that Eleanor was resting. The door to her room closed, and I would stand in the hallway feeling the walls of my own life draw in another inch. Being erased while you are still alive to watch it happen is a particular kind of cruelty. Having your own son believe a stranger's version of you over your own voice. And Vanessa did it with a smile and a casserole dish, and everyone around her thought she was a saint, but she had misjudged me, the way nearly everyone in my life had. She saw the silence and mistook it for surrender. She did not know that a woman who has spent 40 years coaxing broken bodies back from the edge learns something the loud and the impatient never do. She learns how to wait. She learns that the slowest work is often the work that lasts. So I stopped fighting where she could see me. I let her think I was confused. I let her think I had given up. And in the small hours, when the building was quiet, I began, very carefully, to fight back. I kept my notebook against my heart now. I started a second one and hid it where no one would think to look. Every false text, every overheard lie, every date and time. I was building a record of my own, and I told only one person in the world what I was doing, Eleanor, who looked at me across the puzzle table one gray afternoon and said the words that changed everything. "I have been doing the same," she whispered, "and I think it is time I told you a secret." Eleanor waited until the common room had emptied, until the last shuffling resident had gone in for the evening, before she told me her secret. "I am not a fool. Maggie," she said, "I knew the moment that girl walked in here what she was. I have outlived a husband, a son who broke my heart, and more grasping relatives than I can count. I know a vulture when one circles. So I made arrangements." She told me then, in her low and steady voice, what she had done. Months before, when she first understood that Vanessa had set her sights on her, Eleanor had a small camera installed in her room. Her great niece, the one decent young person left in her family, had ordered it and set it up during a visit. A tiny thing tucked among the framed photographs on her dresser, the kind people use to watch their front porches. It recorded quietly, day and night, to a little card. No one knew it was there. No one ever thought to look. Why would they? Who suspects an 80-year-old woman of keeping watch? "I have been recording everything," Eleanor said. "Every visit, every conversation, every time that girl comes in here and tries to frighten me into changing my papers." I stared at her. I asked what she meant. Change her papers? Eleanor's mouth tightened. Vanessa, it turned out, had not only been working on me, she had been working on Eleanor too, and far more boldly. She had come into that room again and again, sometimes alone, and pressed Eleanor to change her will. She had brought documents. She had suggested, in that sweet poisoned voice, that since Eleanor had no real family to speak of, perhaps she ought to consider those who were so devoted to her now. Perhaps she ought to think about David, a good man, and his wife who cared so much. And when sweetness did not work, Vanessa had tried something uglier. She had threatened to have Eleanor move to a different facility, a worse one, far away. She had implied that a single word from her could see the old woman declared incompetent, stripped of her choices, packed off somewhere to be forgotten. The same weapon, the exact same weapon she was sharpening for me. But Eleanor was not me. Eleanor had teeth, and she had money, and she had spent a long life refusing to be bullied. She had let Vanessa believe she was wearing her down, and the whole time, that little camera on the dresser had been watching, recording every threat, every lie, every flash of the real Vanessa behind the smile. "I have done more than that," Eleanor said. She reached into the bag that always hung from her chair and pressed something into my hand. It was a small recorder, the kind they sell for taking notes. "There is a message on here," she said, "for when I am gone, and they come for what is mine, and they will come. Maggie, I have made certain that what is mine goes where it ought to the one person in this whole place who ever sat with me and was simply glad I was alive." She closed my fingers around the recorder and held them there, her grip surprisingly strong for such a frail hand. I tried to refuse. I did not want her money. I told her so, fiercely. I told her I did not visit her for anything. I visited her because she was my friend. "I know," she said softly. She did not say anything more about her reasons. She only looked at me with those sharp old eyes that had read so many people so well, and something in her face was gentler than I had ever seen it. "You have given me back something I thought was gone for good," she said at last. "I will not tell you what it is worth. You would only argue with me. Just keep the recorder safe. Keep the notebooks safe. Keep yourself safe. And when the time comes, and that girl thinks she has won, you will know what to do." I held the little recorder in my hand, and I felt the weight of everything she was trusting me with, and I could not speak. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 3 days later, on a cold gray morning in the autumn, I crossed the hall to Eleanor's room for our usual afternoon, and there was no sharp voice telling me the sky pieces went on the left. The room was very still. A nurse stood by the bed with her hands folded. Eleanor had passed in her sleep, sometime in the night. Her weak old heart had simply, quietly stopped. I sat with her a long while before they took her away. I held her cold hand the way I had held so many hands over the years, and I told her she was the best friend I had ever had, and that I was sorry I had not believed her sooner about Vanessa, and that I would not let her down. I do not know if the dead can hear us, but I said it anyway, because some things must be said whether anyone is listening or not. I grieved her the way I had grieved my husband, in the quiet, alone. The loneliness came rushing back into my life like water into a breached hull. I had lost the one person who saw me all over again. But this time, I was not the same woman who had been driven to Cedar Hollow in the spring, doubting her own mind. This time, I had a notebook pressed against my heart and a small recorder hidden where no one would find it, and the knowledge of a camera quietly waiting on a dresser across the hall. I had Eleanor's trust and Eleanor's instructions and Eleanor's stubborn belief in me, and I knew, with the same certainty I had once known a body would heal, that Vanessa was coming. The reading of the will was set for the following week. I did not know it yet, but that was where my family would finally show me exactly who they were. The reading of the will took place in a small office downtown, in a building with brass fixtures and carpets so thick it swallowed the sound of footsteps. I had not wanted to go, but Eleanor's attorney had called Cedar Hollow personally and asked me to be present, and so I put on my good gray dress, the one I had worn to Robert's funeral, and I went. I was surprised to find David and Vanessa already there. I had not told them about the will. I had not told anyone, but somehow they knew, and somehow they had decided they belonged in that room. Vanessa wore a black dress and an expression of polite grief, as though she had lost a dear friend rather than a woman she had tried to bully and rob. David sat beside her, stiff and uncomfortable, fiddling with his wedding ring the way he did when he was nervous. He gave me a small, tight nod. He did not say hello. The attorney was a calm, precise man named Mr. Coleman. He had a kind face and the careful manner of someone who had read a great many wills aloud and seen a great many families come apart at the seams over them. He waited until we were settled, and then he began. There were small bequests first, a sum to the great niece who had loved her, the one who set up the camera, donations to a hospital and to a home for retired horses, which made me smile through my grief, because that was exactly like Eleanor. Some personal items, her good jewelry to the niece, a first edition book to a library. And then Mr. Coleman adjusted his glasses, and he read the part that changed the air in the room. The bulk of Eleanor Whitfield's estate, which was considerable, far more than I had ever imagined. The investment accounts and the property and the savings of a long and careful life was to go to me, to Margaret Sullivan, her dear friend. The will said, in Eleanor's own sharp words, who treated me as a person when my own blood treated me as a will to be read. For a moment there was complete silence. Then Vanessa laughed. It was a small, startled sound, the laugh of someone certain there had been a mistake. She actually looked around the room as though waiting for someone to explain the joke. When no one did, the laugh died in her throat, and her face began to change. David had gone very pale. He stared at Mr. Coleman. Then he stared at me. There must be some error, he said. My mother is... He hesitated. She is not well. She has been confused for some time. She could not possibly. He could not even finish the sentence. Mr. Coleman folded his hands. I assure you, he said evenly, that Mrs. Whitfield was of entirely sound mind when she made these arrangements. I met with her several times myself. She was he allowed himself the smallest smile, one of the sharpest individuals I have ever had the pleasure to advise. That was when Vanessa stopped pretending. She rose from her chair. The grief slid off her face like a mask, and what was underneath was something I had glimpsed only in flashes before. Something cold and hard and hungry. She turned to me, and she pointed, and she said the words I think she had been wanting to say for a very long time. "You manipulated her." The accusation landed in that quiet, carpeted room like a stone through glass. "You preyed on a sick old woman," Vanessa said, her voice rising. All the sweetness burned away. "You worked on her for months. You isolated her. You turned her against her own family, and you talked her out of her money." She looked at David, fierce and certain. I told you she was not herself. This is what she has been doing. This is the kind of woman your mother has become." I looked at my son. I waited for him to defend me. I am ashamed to say I still expected it, even then. He was my boy. I had carried him on my hip. I had sung him the birthday song every year of his life. David looked at the floor. He did not defend me. He said, quietly, "Mom, how could you?" And in that moment, something inside me that had been hoping, against all the evidence, finally went still. I did not shout. I did not weep. 40 years of difficult patience and difficult days had taught me that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. I simply looked at the two of them, and I said, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, "You have no idea what kind of woman I am, but you are about to find out." Vanessa smiled then, the cold smile, the hunter's smile. She thought she had won. She thought she was looking at a confused old woman making empty threats. "We will see about that," she said. "We will let a court decide whether you are fit to inherit a fortune, whether you are fit to manage your own affairs at all." That was the first time the threat was spoken aloud. A court. She was going to try to have me declared incompetent, to overturn Eleanor's will, and to take control of my life entirely, all in one stroke. I held her gaze, and I did not look away. And I thought of the notebook against my heart and the recorder hidden in my room, and the little camera that had watched her from a dresser for months. "Go ahead," I said. "Let a court decide." 3 weeks later, the papers were served. They were suing to invalidate the will, claiming undue influence and fraud. And they had filed a separate petition, the one that frightened me most of all, asking the court to declare me mentally incompetent and to appoint a guardian over me and everything I owned. They wanted everything: my money, my freedom, my very right to speak for myself. And they were certain they would get it, because they still believed I was finished. The papers came on a Thursday, delivered to Cedar Hollow by a young man in a wrinkled shirt who looked embarrassed to be handing legal documents to an old woman in a cardigan. I read them 3 times, sitting on the edge of my narrow bed. The language was cold and formal, but the meaning was simple enough. My son and his wife were asking a judge to declare that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. They wanted a guardian appointed over me, which would mean someone else, almost certainly Vanessa, would control my money, my medical decisions, where I lived, even whether I could refuse a visitor. And they were asking the court to throw out Eleanor's will, claiming I had used my influence to defraud a vulnerable woman. If they won, I would lose everything in a single afternoon, not just Eleanor's gift, my freedom, my voice, my very standing as a person who could be trusted to speak for herself. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I sat in that small room as the autumn light faded, and I let myself feel all of it, the fear and the grief and the deep, weary ache of being betrayed by my own child. I let myself cry, alone, where no one could use my tears as evidence of a fragile mind. And then I dried my eyes, and I got to work. Everyone expected me to hire a lawyer. Even the kind nurse who slipped me a cup of tea that evening asked whether I had someone good to represent me. I told her I would be representing myself, and she looked at me the way you look at a person who has perhaps confirmed every worry her family ever voiced. I understood the look. A 67-year-old woman accused of being too confused to manage her own checkbook, planning to stand alone against a professional attorney. It sounds like exactly the foolish, prideful decision a failing mind might make. But I had my reasons, and they were sound. Their whole case rested on the claim that I could not think for myself. There was no better way to answer that lie than to stand up in open court and think circles around them, with no one speaking for me. And there was a deeper reason, one I did not fully understand until much later. My whole life, other people had spoken for me, decided who I was, just once. Before the end, I wanted to speak for myself, and I wanted them to have no choice but to listen. So I prepared the way I had once prepared a patient for a long recovery, patiently, one piece at a time. The hardest part was the phone calls. There was one I almost did not make. His name is Tommy. 40 years ago, he was a boy of 9, and the fever had taken his legs, and the doctors said he would never walk. I worked with that child for 11 months. I still remember the morning he took his first steps across his own kitchen while his parents wept in the doorway. He sent me a Christmas card every year after that. For 30 years, I had kept everyone in a shoebox under my bed. I had not spoken to him in a long time, but I dialed the number, and a grown man answered. And when I told him who it was, his voice broke right there on the line. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. My goodness, Mrs. Sullivan. I told him what was happening, that my own family was trying to have me declared unfit, that they were calling me a confused old woman who could no longer be trusted. I had meant to ask, carefully, whether he might be willing to speak to who I once was. I did not get the chance to ask. He was already saying it. "You tell me when and where," he said, and his voice was fierce now, fierce the way Eleanor's used to be. "I will drive through the night. I will stand up in that courtroom and tell them what you did for me. You gave me my whole life. Mrs. Sullivan, there is not a confused bone in your body, and there never was." He paused, and when he spoke again, it was quieter. How dare they say that about you? I had to sit down on the edge of the bed. I had spent so long being told I was disappearing that I had half believed it. And here was a voice out of 40 years ago, a man whose first steps I had coaxed out of him one painful inch at a time, telling me he remembered exactly who I was. That phone call did something the legal papers could not. It reminded me. There were other calls after that, other patients. The Cedar Hollow nurses who had watched Vanessa's performances and harbored their own quiet doubts. Eleanor's great niece, who knew precisely what her aunt had thought of my daughter-in-law. One by one, the people who knew the truth said the same thing Tommy had said. We remember you. We will speak for you. And then there were the records. This was where they had badly miscalculated, though they did not know it. They thought of me as a tired old woman in a nursing home. They had forgotten what 40 years in medicine actually teaches a person. I knew exactly what the law required to declare someone incompetent. I knew the cognitive tests, the criteria, the medical standards, better than the tired doctor Vanessa had paid to glance at me. And I had kept records my whole life. My notebook. Every visit with Eleanor documented in my careful hand, dated and detailed. My second secret notebook, logging every false text and overheard lie. Eleanor's recorder, holding a dead woman's voice, and across the hall, in an empty room, a little camera still waiting. I built my case the way I had built 1,000 recoveries, one small, patient piece at a time. And on the morning of the trial, I walked into that courthouse alone, an old woman with a folder under her arm and no lawyer at her side. Every single one of them thought that meant I had already lost. The courtroom was colder than I had expected. I do not mean the temperature, though that was true as well. I mean the feeling of the place. It was a plain room, smaller than the ones you see on television, with rows of wooden benches and tall windows that let in a thin gray light. But there was a weight to it. This was a room where lives were decided, where a stranger in a black robe held the power to take a woman's freedom with the stroke of a pen. I arrived early, the way I have arrived early to everything my whole life. I took my seat at the long table on the right, set my folder squarely in front of me, and folded my hands on top of it. Then I waited, and I watched. David and Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later, with their attorney. His name was Mr. Reese, and he was everything I was not. Tall, polished, expensive, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. He carried a leather briefcase and the easy confidence of a man who wins. He glanced at me once, at the old woman sitting alone with her cardboard folder, and I watched him decide, in that single glance, that this would be an easy day. I had seen that look before, on doctors who underestimated a patient, on people who mistook my quiet for simplicity. It no longer stung me. In fact, I welcomed it. An opponent who underestimates you has already handed you an advantage. Vanessa sat behind him, composed and lovely in a navy dress, the very picture of a daughter-in-law burdened by a painful family duty. She did not look at me. David sat beside her, and he looked everywhere but at me as well. My son had aged in the weeks since the will. There were shadows under his eyes. I told myself I did not care. I was not entirely successful. The bailiff called the room to order. We rose. The judge entered, and I felt my heart steady itself the way it used to before a difficult procedure. His name was Harold Whitman. He was an older man, perhaps 70, with silver hair and a deliberate, unhurried way of moving, as though he had long ago decided that nothing in a courtroom was worth rushing. He settled into his chair, arranged his papers, and looked out over the room with eyes that gave away nothing. I had done my research on him in those 3 weeks, the way I researched everything. A former prosecutor, a man with a reputation for fairness and for being very, very difficult to deceive. A man, I had read, who came from a family of nurses and doctors and held the medical profession in quiet regard. I did not yet know how much that last detail would matter. Mr. Reese began, and he was good. I will give him that. He rose smoothly and addressed the court in a warm, reasonable voice, the voice of a man who only wanted what was best for a poor, confused old woman and her grieving family. "This is a sad case, Your Honor," he said. "It is the case of a family watching a beloved mother decline and trying, against her resistance, to protect her." He spoke of my age. He spoke of my recent widowhood, of the grief that had, he suggested, unsettled my mind. He spoke of my move to Cedar Hollow, framing it not as something done to me, but as something done for me by a loving son. He spoke of my isolation, my forgetfulness, the concerns of my family that had grown over a long and painful year. And then he spoke of Eleanor, a lonely, wealthy, dying woman, he called her, vulnerable, without close family to look out for her interests. And into her life, he said, had come Margaret Sullivan, a woman with medical training who knew exactly how to ingratiate herself with the sick and the elderly, a woman who had spent months alone with this vulnerable widow, isolating her from others, making herself indispensable, and who had emerged from that friendship with a fortune that by rights should never have come to her. It was clever. I had to admit it was clever. He took every good thing I had done and turned it into evidence against me. My kindness became calculation. My medical knowledge became a weapon. My friendship with a lonely woman became a long con. And the worst of it was that, told his way, with his smooth and reasonable voice, it almost sounded true. I watched the faces in the room as he spoke. I watched 2 of the Cedar Hollow nurses, called as witnesses, shift uncomfortably in their seats. I watched the judge listen without expression, and I watched David. My son sat with his head slightly bowed, and as Mr. Reese painted his portrait of a scheming, declining woman, I saw something I had not expected. I saw doubt, not about me, about the story. For just a moment, as the attorney described a mother David thought he knew, a flicker of something crossed my son's face, a small frown, a glance toward Vanessa that she did not return. It was gone in an instant. But I had spent 40 years reading the truth that people tried to hide, and I knew what I had seen. It was the first thin crack in the wall they had built around me. When Mr. Reese finished, he sat down with the satisfied air of a man who had already won. The judge made a note. Then he looked across the room at me, the old woman alone at her table, and he asked whether I wished to make an opening statement. Every eye in that room turned to me. Vanessa, finally, looked at me too, and there was that smile again, certain I would stammer, or weep, or crumble. I rose to my feet. My hands were perfectly steady. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I believe I do." I kept my opening statement short. I had learned long ago that the strongest thing in any room is often the quietest. I told the court that I would not waste their time with speeches, that I had no fine words, only facts, and that the facts would speak more clearly than I ever could. I told them that the people bringing this case had built it on a single claim, that my mind was failing, and that I intended to disprove that claim, not with my own testimony alone, but with evidence they could see and hear and hold in their hands. Then I thanked the judge, and I sat down. I saw Mr. Reese's eyebrow lift slightly. He had expected rambling. He had expected a confused old woman digging her own grave with every sentence. The brevity unsettled him, just a little, and that was exactly what I had intended. But the morning that followed was not mine. It was theirs, and I will not pretend it was anything but brutal. Mr. Reese called his witnesses, and one by one, they painted me as a woman coming apart. The first was the doctor, the tired man Vanessa had paid to evaluate me, the one who had glanced at his watch the whole time. On the stand, he was transformed into an authority, calm and credentialed, and he spoke of his professional concerns regarding my cognitive state. He used careful words: mild disorientation, possible early decline, difficulty with recall. He never quite said the word incompetent, but he laid every stone of the path that led there. And he did it in the confident voice of a man no one in that room was qualified to question, except that I was. But my turn had not yet come. Then came the Cedar Hollow administrator, who testified, reluctantly I thought, that there had been reports of me wandering, of confusion in the halls at night. She did not say who had made those reports. She did not have to. I knew. They had all come from one smiling source. Then Mr. Reese introduced his documents, and this was the worst of it. He had the text messages, my phone, displayed on a screen for the whole room to see, message after message in which a frightened, lonely old woman wrote to her son about her failing memory, her confusion, her fear that she was losing herself. I felt my face grow hot as I read them, because I recognized every single one as a forgery, written by Vanessa's hand from my own phone. And yet there they were, in my name, time-stamped and damning. To anyone who did not know the truth, they were the confession of a woman who knew her own mind was slipping. I sat very still and let it wash over me. It was hard. I will not lie to you. There is a particular helplessness in watching a false version of yourself constructed in front of strangers, piece by piece, and being unable, yet, to tear it down. And then Mr. Reese called my son. David took the stand. He would not look at me as he passed. He was sworn in, and he sat with his hands clasped, and Mr. Reese walked him gently through the story they had built together. How worried he had been, How his mother had changed after his father died. How she had forgotten his birthday, sent him those frightened messages, attached herself to a wealthy stranger. How it broke his heart to be here. But he believed, he truly believed, that his mother needed protecting from herself. He said it all in a low, miserable voice. And the terrible thing, the thing that hurt more than any of the lies, was that I believe he meant it. That was Vanessa's true cruelty. She had not simply turned my son against me. She had made him believe he was doing it out of love. She had built him a mother who was disappearing, and the man on that stand was genuinely grieving her, even as the real woman sat 10 feet away, with her heart breaking. "Mom needs help," he said quietly. At the end, that is all this ever was. We just want her to be safe. I looked at my boy on that witness stand, and for one long moment, the fear I had been holding back rose up and nearly swallowed me whole. Because here is the truth no one tells you about standing alone. There are moments when you wonder whether you are wrong, when everyone in the room, the doctor, the administrator, your own son, has lined up to say the same thing about you. The doubt creeps back in. The old poison Vanessa had spent a year pouring into me. What if the records did not matter? What if the camera footage was not enough? What if a charming attorney and a weeping son and a tired doctor were simply more convincing than an old woman with a cardboard folder, no matter what the truth was? I looked at Vanessa, and she was watching me, and she let me see it then, just for an instant. The triumph. She thought the morning had buried me. She thought she had already won. The judge called for the midday recess. The room began to stir, people rising, gathering their coats. David stepped down from the stand and walked past me without a word, his eyes on the floor. I sat alone at my table as the courtroom emptied, and I let myself feel, for 1 minute, the full weight of how alone I truly was. Then the minute passed. I opened my folder. I looked at my notebook, at my timeline, at the list of what was still to come, the recording, the camera, the medical truth they did not know I carried. I thought of Eleanor, sharp and fierce, telling me that good women are the easiest to rob because they cannot imagine what other people will do. Well, I could imagine it now. I had watched it all morning, and this afternoon it would be my turn to speak. When the court reconvened that afternoon, Mr. Reese rested his case with the satisfied look of a man tidying up after an easy victory. Then the judge turned to me and asked whether I wished to present my defense. I rose, and I did not go to my folder first. I went to something they did not expect. "Your Honor," I said, "the entire case against me rests on one claim, that my mind has failed. Everything they have shown you this morning serves that single accusation. So before I present a single document, I would like to address it directly. I would like the court to test it." Mr. Reese looked up. "I would like to undergo a cognitive evaluation," I said. "Here, now, in open court, administered by an impartial professional, not one chosen and paid by the people suing me. If my mind is failing, Your Honor, it will show. And if it is not, then the foundation of their entire case falls away." The room went very still. I saw Mr. Reese half rise, as though to object, and then sink back down, because there was nothing he could say. How could the man arguing that I was incompetent refuse to let the court actually measure my competence? To refuse would be to admit he was afraid of the answer. The judge studied me for a long moment. Then the smallest smile touched the corner of his mouth, and he said, "That is a reasonable request, Mrs. Sullivan. The court will arrange it." A geriatric specialist was located, a brisk woman named Dr. Ahn, who happened to be in the building for another matter and had no connection to anyone in that room. She came to the front of the court and administered the standard examinations, the ones I knew so well from the other side, the questions about the date and the season and the place, the list of words to remember, the counting backward, the clock to draw. I answered every question clearly and without hesitation. When she gave me a list of words and asked me to recall them several minutes later, after a distraction, I gave them all back to her in order, and then, because I am human, and because I had spent a year being told I was empty, I gave them back to her a second time, in reverse. I heard a small sound from the gallery. One of the Cedar Hollow nurses had put her hand to her mouth. Dr. Ahn turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "I see no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. This is one of the sharper assessments I have administered in some time. In my professional opinion, this woman is entirely competent to manage her own affairs." I let that settle over the room. I looked just once at Vanessa. Her composure had cracked at the edges. She had built her entire case on a foundation that had just dissolved in front of her in 5 minutes in open court. Then I asked the court's permission to do one more thing. I picked up the report, the one the tired doctor had filed, the one Mr. Reese had leaned on all morning, and I began, gently, to take it apart. I am a physical therapist, Your Honor, 40 years. For 12 of those years, I served on a hospital review board that evaluated exactly this kind of assessment. I know what a proper cognitive evaluation requires, and this is not one. I walked them through it, slowly, so everyone in the room could follow. By the doctor's own notes, his examination had taken 11 minutes, a real assessment. The kind Dr. Ahn had just performed takes far longer. He had administered none of the standardized tests she had used. His conclusions rested on his own vague impressions, and, more than that, on a history of my supposed decline that had been handed to him in writing before he ever met me, by the very people who stood to profit from my being declared unfit. I read his own words aloud. Where he wrote of the patient's documented confusion, I asked the court to notice exactly who had authored that documentation. "He never tested my memory," I said. "He inherited someone else's account of it. He did not evaluate a patient. He confirmed a conclusion that had already been written for him." By the time I finished, the report that had seemed so authoritative that morning lay in pieces. Mr. Reese was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was leaning forward, very still. The easy confidence drained out of his face. Behind him, Vanessa sat rigid, and the smile was entirely gone. But it was the judge I was watching, because as I spoke about hospital boards and standardized assessments and the medical standards for evaluating competence, something had changed in his expression. He was no longer looking at me as a frightened old woman alone at a table. He was looking at me the way one professional looks at another who has just demonstrated she knows the subject better than anyone in the room. He had not, until that moment, understood who I was. None of them had. They had all read the same story Vanessa wrote, The Sweet Declining Widow, and not one of them had ever thought to look behind it. The judge reached for the thick folder on his bench. My file. The records I had submitted weeks earlier with my response to their petition. The ones no one had truly read, because everyone already knew how this story was supposed to end. He opened it. He began to turn the pages, slowly, the way a man reads something that is surprising him more with every line. And the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what the quiet old woman alone at the table had been carrying all along. The judge read for a long time. I had submitted the file weeks earlier, along with my written response to their petition, and I had suspected that no one had truly read it. Why would they? Everyone already knew how this story ended. The confused old woman would lose, the loving family would prevail, and the paperwork was only a formality. So my file had sat in its folder, unopened, while the whole room rehearsed my defeat. Now Judge Whitman was reading it, and I watched his face change, page by page. He turned one sheet, then another. His brow drew together. He paused on something, read it twice, and set down his pen with a small, deliberate sound that carried across the silent room. Then he looked up at me, and there was something in his expression that had not been there all morning. Surprise, and underneath it, something that looked almost like respect. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said slowly, "may I ask you a few questions?" "Of course, Your Honor." He glanced down at the open file, then back at me. "It says here that you were a licensed physical therapist for 40 years. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "That you specialized, for much of that time, in rehabilitation medicine, that you trained junior clinicians, and that for 12 years you served on a hospital review board evaluating patient assessments, including," he tapped the page, "cognitive competency evaluations of the very kind submitted in this case." "That is correct, Your Honor." He turned another page. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the lights overhead. "It says you received a state commendation for your work with stroke and trauma patients, that you published in a clinical journal on rehabilitation outcomes, that you continued, even in retirement, to keep detailed clinical style records, a habit," he glanced up, "that I suspect is relevant to the documents you intend to introduce." "Yes, Your Honor." He removed his glasses then, slowly, and he looked at me for a long moment. And then he said the words that I will carry with me until the day I die. He said them quietly, almost to himself, but in that silent room every single person heard. "This woman," he said, "does not need a lawyer. Behind Mr. Reese, I heard a sharp intake of breath. The attorney had risen halfway from his chair, and now he sank back down, because there was nothing for him to say. He looked at the copy of my file that had been provided to him weeks ago and never read, and he began to turn the pages himself, faster and faster. And I watched the color drain out of his polished face as he understood, finally, exactly who he had spent the morning underestimating. But it was David I was watching. My son had lifted his head. He was staring at me, and his face had gone white. "Mom," he whispered. I do not think he meant to say it aloud. "What is this? Why did you never tell us?" And there it was. The question that broke my heart open, even in my moment of triumph. Why did you never tell us? As though it were my fault that they had never asked. As though in all the years of my marriage and my work and my quiet, ordinary life, not one of them had ever once been curious about the woman setting out the second coffee cup. They had measured me with the wrong ruler my whole life, and now my son sat stunned to learn the ruler had been wrong, as though the error were mine and not theirs. I did not answer him. I could not. Not yet. Not without my voice breaking. And I would not give Vanessa the satisfaction. The judge replaced his glasses and addressed Mr. Reese directly. "Counselor," he said, his voice cool. "I will proceed from this point with the understanding that Mrs. Sullivan is entirely competent to represent herself, and is in fact considerably more qualified than most to speak to the medical questions at the heart of this case. The petition to declare her incompetent appears, on the evidence before me, to be without foundation." He let that sit. "But I will hear the rest of her defense before I rule." "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Reese said. The confidence was gone from his voice. Not entirely, but enough. I stood at my table, an old woman in a gray cardigan, and I felt the ground in that room shift beneath all of us. For the first time, they were not looking at the broken thing Vanessa had built. They were looking at me, the real me, the woman who had put 1,000 broken bodies back together, the woman who had read the truth in trembling hands for 40 years, the woman who had been quietly, patiently building her case while they all rehearsed her defeat. Vanessa was staring straight ahead now, her jaw tight, her hands clenched in her lap. The performance had cracked. The room had begun to turn, and she could feel it, the way prey feels the wind change. But I was not finished. I had disproven the lie about my mind. I had shown the court who I was. That was the foundation. Now I would build the rest of it, and I would build it the way I had built everything in my life, brick by patient brick, until there was nothing left of their case but rubble. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady again. "The petition claims I influenced Eleanor Whitfield, that I isolated a vulnerable woman and turned her against her family for my own gain. I would like to show the court what actually happened in that room at Cedar Hollow." I reached into my folder because Eleanor, I said, had been keeping records of her own. "Your Honor," I said, "I would like to introduce a recording, a video recording, made over a period of several months inside Mrs. Whitfield's room at Cedar Hollow, with her full knowledge and consent." Mr. Reese was on his feet at once. "Objection, Your Honor. We have received no notice of any such recording. This is highly irregular." It had been disclosed, in fact, in the materials I had filed, buried in the same documents no one had bothered to read. The judge said as much, dryly, and overruled him. Then he asked me to explain what the recording was. I told them that Eleanor Whitfield, no fool at the end of a long and watchful life, had recognized exactly what was happening to her, that months before her death, she had a small camera installed among the photographs on her dresser, that it had recorded quietly, day and night, and that no one had ever suspected it was there. Because, I said, looking at Vanessa, who suspects an 80-year-old woman of keeping watch. Vanessa had gone very still. The footage was brought up on the screen at the front of the courtroom, the same screen that had displayed my forged text messages that morning. There was no sound at first, only the still image of Eleanor's room, the bed, the window, the dresser with its framed photographs. A date and time stamp ran in the corner. And then the room began to play out its quiet record of the truth. The first clip showed an ordinary afternoon. Eleanor in her chair, myself across from her. The two of us bent over a jigsaw puzzle, talking and laughing. There was no sound, but you did not need it. You could see it. Two old women, easy in each other's company. No isolation, no manipulation, just friendship. I heard one of the Cedar Hollow nurses make a small sound in the gallery, something between a sigh and a sob. Then I asked the clerk to advance to the clips I had marked, the ones with Vanessa in them, and the room changed. There was Vanessa, alone with Eleanor, on a date the stamp showed to be 3 weeks before the old woman died. She had brought papers. You could see her setting them on the little table, sliding them toward Eleanor, her finger tapping where a signature should go. Eleanor's face, even on the grainy footage, was a study in cold refusal, her arms folded, her chin lifted, and Vanessa, the sweet and grieving daughter-in-law, leaned over her, and her face was not sweet at all. It was hard, and her mouth was moving fast. And though there was no sound, you did not need a single word to understand that she was not asking. She was demanding. I had, however, obtained the sound from a later visit, and this was the clip I had saved. When it played, Vanessa's voice filled the courtroom, her real voice, stripped of all its honey. "You are a foolish old woman," it said, "and you are going to die alone in this place, and no one is going to care, unless you do the sensible thing now." The footage showed her standing over Eleanor, who sat small and frail in her chair, but utterly unbowed. "I can have you moved," Vanessa said. "One word from me about your confusion, and they will declare you incompetent and ship you somewhere far worse than this. Is that what you want? Or are you going to be reasonable about your estate?" And then the part that I had wept over the first time I watched it, alone in my room. Eleanor's voice, thin but absolutely clear. "I would sooner leave every cent to that woman across the hall," she said, "than a single dollar to a snake like you. At least Margaret never wanted anything from me but my company." On the screen, Vanessa's face twisted. She said something then about me, about the meddling old nurse across the hall, and the words she used I will not repeat in this account, because they were ugly, and because the gasp that went through the courtroom said everything that needed saying. She called me names. She spoke of plans to deal with me too, once Eleanor was gone. She had no idea, of course, that she was being recorded. She believed herself perfectly safe, alone with a frail old woman she intended to rob. The clip ended. The silence in that courtroom was absolute. I turned and looked at Vanessa, and the smile, that smile I had first seen at Cedar Hollow, the hunter's smile, the smile she had worn through every lie and every false tear, was gone, completely gone. Her face had drained to a sickly white, and her hands gripped the edge of the table. And for the first time since I had met her, my daughter-in-law looked exactly like what she was: cornered, caught, small. But it was David's face that I could not stop looking at. My son was staring at the dark screen as though it had struck him. He had heard his wife's voice, the real one, the one she had never let him hear. He had watched her stand over a dying woman and threaten her. He had heard her speak of his mother in words that turned my own stomach. And I watched the story he had been told for a year, the careful, loving story Vanessa had built him, the one in which he was the devoted son protecting a failing mother, crack apart in front of his eyes. He turned and looked at his wife, and the way he looked at her I had never seen before. Not anger, not yet. Something worse. The dawning horror of a man realizing he had been lied to by the one person he trusted most, and that he had carried those lies, in good faith, into a courtroom against his own mother. "Mom," he said again. But this time he was not asking me a question. This time his voice broke on the word, and I knew the wall Vanessa had built was finally about to come down. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I reached into my folder one last time, and I took out the small recorder Eleanor had pressed into my hand 3 days before she died. "Your Honor," I said, and my voice was not quite as steady now. "There is one more thing. Before she passed, Mrs. Whitfield made a recording. She gave it to me herself. She told me to keep it safe and to use it when the time came. She knew, even then, that this day would come. I would like the court to hear her own words." The judge nodded. Mr. Reese did not object. I do not think he had any objections left in him. I set the little recorder on the table, and I pressed the button. And into that silent courtroom came the voice of my friend, returned from the other side of the grave. It was thin, and it wavered, the voice of a woman whose body was failing her. But the mind behind it was sharp and clear as winter air. There was no confusion in it, no frailty of thought, only Eleanor, exactly as she had been, fierce to the very end. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield. The recording began to and I am of perfectly sound mind, whatever anyone may try to claim after I'm gone. I am making this recording on my own, with no one in the room, so that no one can say I was led to it." She gave a small, dry laugh that I knew so well it cracked my heart. I have outlived everyone who ever loved me, and a good many who never did, and I have learned to tell the difference. If you are hearing this, she went on, then I am dead, and someone is trying to take what is mine and call my friend Margaret a thief for accepting it. So let me set the record straight while I still can. She told it all in her own steady, unhurried voice. She laid it out for the court. How she had come to Cedar Hollow alone, set aside by her own family, visited chiefly by relatives, counting the days until her funeral. How a quiet woman across the hall, a retired physical therapist, had begun to sit with her and ease the pain in her ruined hands and stay long after her shift of friendship was done, asking for nothing. How that woman had given her back something she had thought was gone for good. The simple dignity of being treated like a person. Then she spoke of Vanessa. She named her. She described how the younger woman had come to her room again and again, pressing her to change her will, threatening to have her declared incompetent, and moved away if she refused. She described, in plain, unhurried words, every threat, and she said, into that recorder, that she had installed a camera precisely because she had known no one would believe a frail old woman over a charming young one, and she had wanted proof. And then she said the thing that I had been unable to speak aloud myself, the thing that undid the entire case against me, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of truth. I am leaving my estate to Margaret Sullivan, the recording said, of my own free will, in my right mind, for one reason and one reason only. She loved me before she ever knew I had a penny to my name. She healed my body when my own children could not be troubled to telephone. She never once treated me like a bank account waiting to be opened. Eleanor's voice dropped, soft now, almost gentle. Do you understand how rare that is, at the end of a life like mine, to be loved for nothing, to be seen? Margaret gave me that, and what I am leaving her is not payment. You cannot pay for such a thing. It is only thanks. There was a pause on the recording, a long breath. She never asked me for anything, Eleanor said. Not once. That is how you know. And then the recording ended. I have stood in many rooms full of grief in my life. Hospital rooms, funeral homes, the kitchen floor where my husband died. But I have never heard a silence like the one in that courtroom. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just heard the truth, plainly and finally, and could no longer pretend otherwise. One of the nurses in the gallery was weeping openly. The judge sat very still, his hand resting flat on the file in front of him, his eyes lowered. Even Mr. Reese had set down his pen and was staring at the table, a man who had built his mourning on a foundation that had just been washed entirely away. And David was crying. My son, a grown man of 40, sat at that plaintiff's table with tears running down his face, and he was not bothering to hide them. He had heard the dead woman describe his wife's threats. He had heard her describe his mother's kindness. He had spent a year believing he was protecting me, and in the space of a single afternoon, he had learned that everything he believed had been a story written by the woman sitting beside him, and that he had carried that story like a weapon into a room, and aimed it at his own mother's heart. He looked at me across that courtroom through his tears. My boy looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was small and frightened and needed his mother to make the world right again. And then, slowly, he turned to look at his wife. Vanessa felt it. She turned to him, and she began to speak, low and fast, the honey rushing back into her voice. "David," she said, "David, listen to me. You know how she is. You know what your mother is capable of." But David was already shaking his head. And then my son did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He pushed back his chair. He stood up, and in a voice that shook but did not break, he said, "Your Honor, I would like to say something." The judge regarded my son for a moment. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "you are a named party in this case, not a witness under examination. But this is a hearing on competence and undue influence, and I will allow you to speak. Go ahead." David stood there at the plaintiff's table, his hands trembling, and for a moment I thought he would not be able to get the words out. Then he found them. "I came into this courtroom believing I was protecting my mother," he said. His voice was rough. "I believed she was sick. I believed she was confused. I believed she had been taken advantage of." He stopped, swallowed hard, and made himself go on. "I believed all of it because my wife told me so. Every day, for over a year. She told me. She showed me the messages my mother supposedly sent. She told me about the wandering, the forgetting, the strange behavior. I never saw any of it myself." He looked at me then, and his face crumpled. "I never saw it because it was never real. I just believed her. God help me. I just believed her." Vanessa was on her feet now, too. "David, stop it. You are upset. This is exactly what she does. She gets inside your head." But David was not listening to her anymore. He had reached into his coat, and he took out a folded sheaf of papers, and his hands shook as he unfolded them. "After I heard that recording," he said, "I could not stop thinking about something. The messages, the ones my mother supposedly sent me, talking about her own confusion. I always wondered why they came at strange hours, 4 p.m, when I knew she napped, late at night. So last week, I did something I should have done a year ago. I pulled the phone records, both accounts, mine and my mother's." The room was utterly still. "These messages," David said, holding up the papers, "did not come from my mother's phone when my mother had it." He turned to the judge. "They came on days my mother was at meals, or in the common room, or sitting with Mrs. Whitfield. I cross-referenced them against the Cedar Hollow activity logs, the ones my mother already submitted to this court. Every single one of those frightened, confused messages was sent during a window when my mother was somewhere else, and her phone was alone in her room." He drew a breath. "And there is only one person who was visiting that room, alone, on every one of those dates." He did not say her name. He did not have to. He laid the papers on the table in front of the clerk, and he stood there, a man who had just handed the court the evidence that destroyed his own wife's case, and he looked at the floor. I had not asked him to do this. I want that understood. I had not known the phone records existed. My son had gone looking for the truth entirely on his own. The moment he was finally given a reason to doubt the story he had been fed, and he had found it, and he had brought it into the light, knowing exactly what it would cost him. Vanessa made a sound I had never heard her make. The last of the performance fell away, and what came out was raw and furious and frightened all at once. "You stupid man," she hissed at him. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? After everything And she caught herself. But it was too late. The everything I had hung in the air, and everyone in that room understood what it meant. The judge had heard enough. "That is sufficient," he said, and there was iron in his voice now. "Mrs. Sullivan, the plaintiffs, and counsel will all be silent." He turned to Mr. Reese, whose face had gone gray. "Counselor, in light of the evidence presented this afternoon, do you wish to continue arguing that your client lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs?" Mr. Reese rose slowly. He looked at the recorder on my table, and the dark screen that had shown the camera footage, and the phone records lying in front of the clerk, and his own client, who would no longer meet his eyes. He was a professional. He knew when a case was not merely lost, but obliterated. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly, "we withdraw the petition for guardianship and the challenge to Mrs. Whitfield's will on grounds of undue influence and fraud." A long pause. "We withdraw that as well, Your Honor." I sat at my table, an old woman in a gray cardigan, and I let the words settle over me. It was over. The thing I had feared most in all the world, losing my freedom, my voice, my very right to speak for myself, was not going to happen. They had come to take everything, and they were leaving with nothing. I should have felt triumphant, and some part of me did. But mostly, looking at my son standing broken at that table, having just sacrificed his marriage on the altar of the truth, I felt something far quieter and far sadder than victory. I felt grief for all of it, for the year I had spent doubting my own mind, for Eleanor, who should have been here to see this, for David, who had finally chosen me and lost so much in the choosing, for the family we might have been, if only they had ever once looked at me and seen who I really was. The judge said he would issue his formal ruling the following morning, but that the matter was, for all practical purposes, decided. He thanked the court. He rose. We rose, and as the room began to stir back to life, David turned and looked at me across that courtroom, and in his eyes was a question too large for any words. I did not know yet whether I could answer it. I only knew that the fight was finally over, and that the hardest part, the part that came after, was just beginning. The formal ruling came the next morning, in that same cold courtroom, though it felt like a different place entirely. Judge Whitman read it without flourish, in his slow and deliberate voice. He found that I was of entirely sound mind and fully competent to manage my own affairs, and he dismissed the petition for guardianship as wholly without merit. He found that Eleanor Whitfield's will was valid, made of her own free and informed choice, and that there was no evidence of undue influence whatsoever. On the contrary, he said, the evidence showed a genuine and selfless friendship, and an attempt by others to exploit a vulnerable woman that had been, in his words, among the more troubling things he had seen from his bench in many years. Then he did something I had not expected. He ordered that the matter of the forged messages and the threats recorded on Eleanor's camera be referred to the appropriate authorities for review. Vanessa had withdrawn her petition, he said, but the conduct documented in this courtroom raised serious questions that did not end with the dismissal of a civil case. The law has names for what was done to 2 elderly women in this story, he said, and it does not look away simply because the scheme failed. Vanessa was not there to hear it. She had not come. David told me later that she had left their house the night before with 2 suitcases, and that the lawyers were already involved, and that he did not yet know what would become of any of it. He said it flatly, like a man reading a weather report about a storm that had already taken the roof off the house. I will not pretend I felt sorrow for her. I am too old to lie about such things. She had tried to steal my freedom, my friend's last wishes, and my son's love all at once, and she had done it with a smile, whatever the authorities decided. She had earned it herself, but I took no joy in it either. There is no joy in watching a family burn down, even one that lit the match itself. What I felt, walking out of that courthouse into the thin autumn sunlight, a free woman who answered to no one, was something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself, not the broken thing Vanessa had built, not the confused old woman in the brochures. Myself, Margaret Sullivan, who had spent a lifetime putting people back together, and who had, in the end, put herself back together too. And there was the matter of the money. Eleanor's estate was mine now, free and clear. It was more money than I had ever imagined holding in my life. A woman in my position, betrayed by her family, alone in a nursing home, might have been forgiven for taking that fortune and building herself a comfortable fortress, far from everyone who had ever hurt her. I thought about it. I want to be honest. I did think about it, but I kept hearing Eleanor's voice, not the recording, the real one, from all those gray afternoons over the puzzle table. There are treasures in places like this, she had said to me once, watching the other residents shuffle past, and the world has decided every one of them is broken. There were so many of them, sharp, fierce, lonely old people set aside by families who saw only a will to be read, people who sat alone in small rooms, waiting for someone, anyone, to walk through the door and simply be glad to see them. So I made a decision, and it was the easiest one I have ever made. I went back to Eleanor's attorney, and I told him I wanted to build something with her money, the way she had lived her life, on her own terms, in service of the people the world had written off. We called it the Whitfield Fund. I will not give you a list of everything it does. Let me tell you instead about a woman named Ruth. Ruth is 84. She lives in a facility 2 towns over, and until last spring, no one had visited her in 3 years. Her family had stopped coming. The staff were kind but rushed, and a quiet woman who never complained was easy to overlook. One of our advocates, a young man the fund pays to do exactly this, started visiting her every week. He noticed, within a month, that her medication did not match her symptoms. He noticed she had stopped eating. He sat with her, and he listened. And he made sure the people who were supposed to be caring for her actually were. Ruth is doing better now. She does the crossword again. And last week she told our advocate that for the first time in years, she looks forward to Thursdays, because Thursday is the day somebody comes who is glad she is alive. That is what Eleanor's money does now. It buys Thursdays. It puts a pair of watchful eyes in rooms where the smiling, patient predators of the world, the Vanessas, used to operate unseen. It makes certain that no forgotten person in a small room ever has to wonder whether anyone is glad they are still here. Eleanor would have hated the fuss. She would have told me I was doing it wrong, that the sky pieces go on the left. But I think, somewhere, she would have been pleased. She had left her fortune to the one person who would not keep it for herself. I signed the papers on a bright cold morning, almost a year after the day they tried to take everything from me. And as I set down the pen, I understood that this was simply the same work I had always done, the work of 40 years, continued by other means. But there was one more thing I had to do, one more person I had to face, and it was, by far, the hardest part of all. My son was waiting for me outside. David was standing on the courthouse steps in the thin, cold sunlight, with his hands pushed deep into his coat pockets. He looked smaller than I remembered. The shadows under his eyes had deepened, and there was a stillness to him, the particular stillness of a man whose whole life has just come apart and who is standing in the wreckage trying to understand what is left. He did not know what to say to me. I could see it, so I said it first. I told him to walk with me. We went slowly down the block, an old woman and her grown son, past the brass-fixtured building and the coffee shops, into a small park where the last of the autumn leaves were coming down. We sat on a bench. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Some silences need to be sat in before they can be broken. Finally, he said, "I am so sorry, Mom." And then he could say nothing else because he had begun to cry the way he used to cry as a boy, with his whole body. I let him. I did not reach for him right away. I have learned over a long life that the kindest thing is not always to rush in and smooth over the pain. Sometimes a person needs to feel the full weight of what they have done before any comfort can mean a thing. When he had quieted, I took his hand, the same hand I had held when he was small, when he was learning to walk, when the world frightened him, and I told him the truth, gently but completely, that what he had done had wounded me more deeply than I knew how to say. That for a year I had doubted my own mind because the people I loved told me to, that I would carry that wound for the rest of my life. And then I told him that I forgave him, not because what he did was small. It was not. But because I had spent 40 years watching people heal from terrible things, and I knew that you cannot heal what you refuse to set down. I was not going to spend whatever years I had left carrying the weight of his betrayal in my chest. I was too old, and life was too short, and I had a foundation to build, and a friend to honor, and a self, at long last, to live as fully. But I told him forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and that things between us could not simply return to what they had been. Trust, once broken so completely, is rebuilt the way a body rebuilds after a bad injury, slowly, carefully, with proof, over time, that the healing is real. I would let him back into my life, I said, but on my terms now, with my eyes open, as the woman I actually am. He nodded. He understood. I think, for the first time in his adult life, my son truly saw me. I wrote it all down for him later, in a letter, because some things are easier to keep when you can hold them in your hands. I have kept careful records my whole life, and I suppose that letter was the last and most important one I ever made. I told him I loved him. I told him what he had done. I told him what my forgiveness would mean and what it would not. And I told him the one thing I most wanted him to carry forward for himself. And for the grandchild I hope to know better in the years to come. I told him that for my whole life I had let other people hold the ruler. My family measured me and found me wanting, and I believed them. I spent 67 years waiting for them to measure me again and finally find me worthy. The freedom of my life came the day I understood the ruler had been wrong all along, not me, the ruler. That is the thing I want to leave with you, whoever you are, listening to an old woman's story. If you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel you are less than you are, hear me, because I learned this the hard way, and I am giving it to you for free. You do not need the permission of the people who diminished you to know your own worth. You never did. Your value was never theirs to measure. It lives in you, in the quiet record of every kind thing you ever did when no one was watching, in every hand you ever held, in every time you chose to be good, in a world that made it easier not to be. Eleanor saw that in me when no one else would, and that one friendship, at the very end, gave me back my whole life. So that is my story. The story of the day my family learned they had measured me wrong, and the friend who knew my worth before I did, and the freedom I found on the far side of everything I feared. Thank you for spending this time with me. Truly, it means more than you know to be heard. If this story touched your heart in any way, I would love for you to leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from. I read them, and I treasure them, every one. And if you believe, as I have come to believe, that no person should ever be made to feel they are not enough, then stay with me a while longer. Subscribe and walk with me into the next story. There is always another one waiting to be told, and I would be so glad to have you beside me when I tell it.